Welcome,
Okay.
welcome back to Your Anxious Child, 5-Minute Solutions and Interviews with Experts. Gina Rippon has just written the book Off the Spectrum: Why the Science of Autism Has Failed Women and Girls. She is an emeritus professor of cognitive neuroimaging at the Austin Brain Center, where she used brain imaging techniques to investigate patterns of brain activity in developmental disorders such as autism. She's also the author of Gender and Our Brains, and she is from England. And she has very generously agreed to talk to us about her recent book. Is there anything else you'd like to kind of add about yourself that I
No, I
haven't
think
mentioned?
I think you've covered the basics. Yes, yes. So I have a sort of reputation as somebody who is critical of a lot of the work that's been done, neuroscience work, particularly looking at differences between males and females, but also looking at understanding developmental disorders such as autism.
So, if you were a parent of a school age girl and you had some lingering kind of questions in the back of your mind, why does my child always complain about the smells in my car? Or why does she read so much but and doesn't go anywhere without a book? And why can't she keep friends? Why might it actually be helpful to know a little bit about the history of autism as a diagnosis for that parent?
I think it would be very important for the parent, but also for the people that the parent is talking to, because one of the issues that has been uncovered in the history of autism is what I've called the male spotlight problem, the sort of unchallenged belief that autism is a boy thing. And this, it turns out, has informed all aspects of the autism story. So even the sort of public consciousness of what autism is and who is autistic. So we all have a kind of stereotype of the sort of lone nerdy male in particular. But that's also affected clinicians' understanding. So, the initial approach to a clinician by a parent, raising the issues you mentioned, autism would not be top of the list if the child was a girl as opposed to if the child was a boy. And the same thing applies to teachers who are having problems with children in the classroom, the kind of behaviors, um, equal, the same kind of behaviors expressed in boys and girls. But if it was a boy, then the teacher would be more likely to raise the issue of autism than if the child was a girl. Uh, and I'm afraid the same thing has happened in my area of research as neuroimaging, because I've been an autism researcher for many years, and almost all of the people I've had in my scanner have been male, because right at the end of this line of expectations of who is autistic, um, if I was recruiting autistic participants, most of them would be male.
So, so when we kind of think about something as kind of complex as autism, with kind of that often quoted phrase, "If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism." Um, as a neuroscientist, you've obviously been trying to get a handle on the brain basis for kind of autism, both in males and in females. What's a productive way of thinking about it? If it's not going to be something as simple as you've got a bigger amygdala or a anterior cingulate or something like that, what is a productive way to begin thinking about how the brain works if it's not you know just some structural difference?
Structures. Yes. No, I think that's a great question, because neuroscience the history of neuroscience has sort of been focusing on size matters for too long, because it's always been, has this person got a bigger amygdala, as you said, than somebody else, or a group of people on average have bigger amygdalae than others? What is the significance of that? And actually, what we should really be looking at, particularly with a condition as complex as autism, as you say, is how do the users of this brain actually interact with their worlds? So we're much more should be much more interested in how the brain works. And with a condition such as autism, you could say it appears that autistic individuals process the world differently or experience the world differently. So, why is that? What in what situations do they find themselves confused, puzzled, anxious? Because they are clearly experiencing the world differently. So in that case, you need to look at kind of dynamic aspects of the brain. Could we see, for example, you raise the issue of smells. Do autistic individuals' brains respond differently to different kinds of sensory stimuli, like bright lights or loud noises, etc.? So that's a much better way of trying to understand what it is that's different about autistic brains, and why, if that could explain the kind of behavioral patterns, because autism is currently still just diagnosed, in inverted commas, in terms of behavioral differences. So there is no, you can't look at as you said, look at a particular brain and say, oh, that's an autistic brain. And I think people need that's a really important step forward. If people realize that, as a brain imager, I can't put an autistic individual, or I can't be given a whole range of patterns of brain activity and being asked to pick out, which brain is autistic.
So the action at this point in time is in issues of how things kind of connect, functional connectivity. And what do we know, just first of all, given the existing knowledge about any differences that show up with regard to functional connectivity in autism, recognizing your often frustration with the studies that are so heavily male biased. But to start from there,
Yeah, well, I think the connectivity issue that you raised is important, because again, that's a kind of newer way of understanding the brain, not that just looking at different structures and how big they were, but looking at pathways between them, and whether or not there were stronger or weaker pathways in some individuals than others, and also understanding how the brain develops in terms of the connections between different parts of the brain, which will underpin the emerging maturity, one hopes, of the brain. So I think that issue is really important, and that's emerging as significant, providing significant information about what's going on in the autistic brain, because it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's clearly a disorder, and I use the word advisedly. We might get back to that, in terms of how the brain develops, and you can actually start to track the fact that connections within the autistic brain, if looking at some early longitudinal studies, are clearly different in individuals who eventually will be identified as autistic. And this links back, in fact, to genetic research, because autism is one of the most heritable conditions. So it's clearly some kind of genetic basis. And there was, early excitement. Would we find the autism gene? To which the answer, I'm afraid, is no. I think we're up to about 800, if not more, genes as having been identified as relevant to understanding the autistic spectrum. And the majority of those do actually underpin how the brain connects at the cellular level. So even at the level of individual neurons, it's clear that that's something that's going awry in the autistic brain from very early on.
I wonder if you could just expand upon something that you talk about in your book, which is that in autism, there may be some hyperconnectivity going on in early development around local networks, and um, that's, I think you used the phrase, a little overly enthusiastic as one feature of that. Because I think,
Yes,
sometimes when parents kind of talk about the child, well, they were reading at the age of, 2 or 3, and um, feeling quite, you know, perhaps pleased or proud of that, or seeing that.
yes, yeah, yes. Well, I think certainly earlier models based on the connectivity that we've just talked about identified patterns of over connectivity within quite local areas.
Mhm.
And it was as though, perhaps whatever it is that underpins reading, to some extent, those particular networks, maybe they were, or word recognition, perhaps, if is a better way of talking about it. Um, and you could say, oh, there seems to be much more activity within local areas in autistic children, for example. But as time goes on, these connections are reorganized and rerouted, and very often you then start to get the development of longer term connections, and that's what underpins the emergence of greater skills in the typically developing brain. So it's you get local sensory sensitivities, or children are able to recognize differences between shapes. But then as time goes on, then they do start to put it together in a more wide-ranging way. And it looked as if early on, I mean, the way I characterized the autistic brain was almost as though it was an orchestra full of soloists. So there were individual aspects of the brain which were functioning exceedingly well, but they weren't interconnecting. And so that you might get these so-called islets of achievement where children appear to be very good at something in particular, or there was something unusual about the brain, such a high proportion of individuals have perfect pitch, for example, which underpins perhaps some of the musical achievements and musical recognition that is characteristic of some parts of the autistic community. So there were ways in which the brain didn't seem to be organizing itself as a kind of generalist achiever. Um, and that underpins some of the things that you mentioned about children early on having very unusual but very specific skills, like high levels of drawing ability, or tremendous memory skills, and musical skills as well.
When we try to look at some of the kind of common characteristics of kind of autism, and we'll get to the issue of kind of gender or sex differences kind of shortly. Um, you did a study using a game called Zap the Aliens, and which seemed to me to kind of illustrate some kind of core features of autism. And I wonder if you could just talk about that research in terms of what you found, in terms of that may be more general characteristics of autism that might cut between genders.
Mm. Yes, yes. Well, yes, thank you for drawing attention to that. There's a newer way of thinking about how the brain works, which is called the predictive coding model, which suggests that our brains are not just passive recipients of information. Our brains are, the most sophisticated information processing system we know. But it also appears that actually, as part of that information processing, the brain is generating what we call rules or predictions, so that eventually the brain says, well, we've seen this light before, we've heard this sound before. and this is what happens next. So we don't have to process it in depth, which of course is a economy measure, because if the brain was trying to process all of the information the world is throwing at it all of the time, we just wouldn't be able to cope. So it's a kind of filtering mechanism. And it looks as though this applies not just at very basic sensory levels. And that's what we were testing with the Zap the Aliens game. Perhaps just to say to your listeners, this was what we were really interested in, was how the brains were responding to repeated sounds, or repeated visual information, which is actually a very boring experiment. So we had to bury it in a game so that the children were looking at a porthole, and they were having to press a button if an alien appeared in the porthole, and not press a button if a spaceman appeared in the porthole. But what we were really interested in was the sounds that went along with these appearances, or the particular patterns that went along with these appearances. And effectively, it showed that in typically developing brains, the repetition gradually emerged in a rule being generated. So you could actually track this across the brain. So you could see that as the sound was repeated over and over again, there was eventually the initial response to it kind of disappeared, and there was a kind of quietening of that tracking of that sound or the sight. Autistic brains didn't seem to be really good at that. So it was as though the autistic brain didn't have this kind of inbuilt prediction ability. And therefore, every time the sound was played, or the sight, the grid pattern emerged, they responded as though it was the first time they'd heard it, or the brain responded as though the first time it heard it or seen it. And that the theory of that underpins is a very basic aspect of the brain, which people might think, well, autism is diagnosed in terms of social ability, and that is the core aspect of autism, which is why it's called autism, to do with a sort of lack of understanding of social instinct and withdrawal from social situations. But it could well be that understanding the social instinct is itself based on making predictions. If you're interacting with other people, how, what does this facial expression flag up to you, or how do you think they might respond to this kind of question, etc. So quite sophisticated, obviously. But what we're looking at is how a very basic problem in terms of, making predictions could actually be applied to the whole range of autistic behaviors. Sorry, that's quite a long answer to your question, but it was the idea that people have always focused on the social aspects of autism, because that's how it was originally characterized, as children, for some reason, not having any interest in social interaction, or being able to dial down their behavior in terms of appreciating their impact on other people. And that has always been the major characterization of autism. And so we're trying to apply a very basic aspect of brain function to a really complicated aspect of human behavior, namely social interaction.
Which you're reminding me is a bit as a prior podcast interview I did with Peter Vermeulen, who would kind of suggest that kind of a primary deficit in autism is what he called context blindness, not being able to kind of see things in context, but rather, over focused on the kind of the detail, which of course puts you at high risk for being anxious about every possible kind of social encounter you engage in. Because as I think is your phrase, that your brain is basically on high alert all the time.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And interestingly, the other aspect of autism, which is probably what presents most clearly to parents and carers and teachers, etc., of autistic children in particular, but autistic adults as well, is this resistance to change, the kind of panic that can set in if, the school bus goes on a different route, or your food isn't put on the plate in a particular order, etc. Which, if you think about it, it could well be a way of imposing rigid patterns or expectations on a world which your brain hasn't allowed you to make predictions. So those aspects, and the fact that there's a huge focus on understanding absolutely everything in a way of controlling it, which could be focusing on details to the extent that you really notice tiny changes. Because most of us, move through the world in a sort of fairly hand wavy general way, don't notice differences in particular. But if your world, your understanding of the world is very much based on everything being the same, because otherwise it's new and therefore panic inducing, you could see how that could lead to the kind of patterns of behavior which are very often much more disruptive than the kind of social lack of social engagement, which is supposedly the core aspect of autism.
It's interesting. I've talked to people. It's been my kind of powerful impression that this interest in the brain as a kind of a predictive organ is something that's much more prevalent in Europe than it is in the United States as a kind of perspective. Um,
Interesting.
yeah,
I
when
mean,
I
it
talk,
was it was a UK neuroscientist, Carl Friston, who is developing this model. Um, I hadn't noticed that it wasn't particularly a US model.
just
I
doing my
shall
kind of
pursue that.
podcast interviews, doing my podcast interviews, it comes up with you, with Peter Vermeulen, and then with some psychologists in Amsterdam who look at why we're attracted to haunted houses, scary movies, and the like. Um, um,
Yes, yes, yeah. Yes, knocking our brain out of its usual rut, perhaps is.
uh, one question. I wonder if you could help us out. When people get lab results from their primary care physician, it's often a mystery in terms of the kind of the numbers, and we really need help from an expert to make sense of them. Now, there's some clear evidence that autism has some genetic component.
Mhm.
Um, and but making sense of that seems rather difficult. And more importantly, for our discussion, does the genetic contribution to autism play out differently between the sexes, or are there any differences between males and females in terms of how the genetics of autism might play out?
Mm. Yes, that's been a driving question, certainly since the 1970s or 80s, when it was first identified how heritable autism was. Looking at it, Michael Rutter looking at twin studies, for example. Um, Alongside that, when it had by that time emerged, or the understanding of autism as a male problem had become well established, because looking at the case, the epidemiology, it seemed that four times, that's the classic quote, ratio, four times as many boys as girls were being diagnosed as autistic. And the genetic research focused on that and said, well, maybe there's some kind of protective effect that female biology offers, or the female brain offers to females, which is quite unusual because normally the female biology is the villain of the piece with respect to a lot of research in this area. And therefore they started looking at, for example, XY chromosomes and seeing if there was anything they could identify there. And they also started to look at genetic anomalies um, within males and female, autistic males and females. So individuals who'd already been diagnosed with autism, looking at the genome once you could actually measure that. And there was an early suggestion that there was a much higher incidence of genetic anomalies in females who'd been identified as autistic. So the suggestion was that females had to have had a much higher genetic hit, as it were, before they actually passed the threshold and were identified as autistic, because at this point it was becoming clear that we're not just talking about one gene, you're talking about hundreds of different genes, and you could identify the anomalies on the genome. And as it did emerge early on that there was a suggestion that something about being female was meant that there needed to be a much higher accumulation of genetic anomalies before the female was identified as autistic. That hasn't really stood the test of time so far. I mean, in particular, because of what has later emerged is the fact that obviously you were looking at individuals who were already diagnosed, and it became clear that there were a large number of individuals, most of whom were female, who hadn't been diagnosed, who should have been diagnosed. And so the genetic story was being confused by the lack of female autistic females to investigate. With respect to, obviously, we still look at autism, we look at the phenotype of autism, we look at the behavior. And the early problem was that what was characterized as autistic behavior was based on males. So you had a male template, which is part of the reason females were failing to make the cut, as it were, with respect to autism, because the way in which it was being manifested in females now appears to be quite different. But only very few females match this male template, which is an important issue because, I would say this, wouldn't I? But we maybe shouldn't be thinking about male autism versus female autism. We could say there are a group of autistic individuals, most of whom are male, who have this particular pattern, and another group of individuals, most of whom are female, who have a different pattern. Yes, so that's just a rider to put in. This is not true of all males or true of all females.
Okay. In the beginning part of your book, you very carefully and very intriguingly kind of identify the male spotlight problem, where the research is really all done on males. And then you kind of turn to how it may show up differently in females. And you remind me of a paper a psychologist Shelley Taylor wrote on the stress response. And she makes the point that the model of responding to stress with fight or flight or kind of freeze was really all developed on research on male rodents. And when you look at non-human primates and other animals, how there is a gender difference in terms of responding to stress, and that in addition to fight or flight, women also engage in what she calls tend and befriend. Quite simply, if you have an offspring, you can't just engage in fight or flight. You have to at the same time protect them.
Mm-hmm.
And she kind of points out about the tremendous benefit in terms of what she calls tending and befriending in terms of the positive effects of oxytocin in terms of kind of connection.
Mm-hmm.
So it strikes me that this the kind of history of research in terms of being developed on males is actually quite pervasive.
That is true. Yes, that's right. And I mean, coming back to your tend and befriend aspect, one of the early suggestions about the differences between autistic males and autistic females was that girls were being socialized in a way that made them disguise their autism. So they were being taught not to make a fuss, not to stand out, to toe the line, to be a good girl, etc. And there's what's called the kind of people pleasing training, and that's part of the autism story. It's interesting that the observation about camouflaging was made almost as an aside when in the 1980s the diagnostic criteria for autism were extended, and the observation was made that, again, not so many females, and it was commented that perhaps females were just better at disguising their autism, which implies, of course, that once they stop disguising, the autism they display would be the same as boys. Um, and as a second stage, that doesn't appear to be true either. They do, once they do stop disguising their autism and describe what it is they're experiencing. And that's a key step forward, actually talking to autistic individuals and saying, what is it like to be you? It would appear that the autism experienced, the autistic experience of women is different. Whether or not that's based in, actual sex differences in the brain, which, people would say, you're a sex difference denier, which actually I'm not. Um, but it's quite possible that there are some fundamental sex differences in the brain which have become more pertinent and more evident in the extremes of distribution of differences, perhaps in the autistic community, for example. So I think that's right. And I mean, all of the early work on hormones, for example, was mainly done on males. And as we know, that development of pharmaceuticals is very often only until recently done on male models, non-human clinical models. So yes, it's a pervasive problem.
I've taken your kind of position that you've really tried to wrestle with the complexity of the issue. Because on one hand, you have the charming phrase that a gendered world will create a gendered brain. And at the same time, there is, as a neuroscientist, there's obviously a biological underpinning to everything.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I think the issue is gendered brain is important because I'm trying to flag up that I'm still a neuroscientist. Otherwise, I've wasted decades of my research career. Um, I think the issue is that people always believed it was either what they used to call the nature or nurture. So it was either all biological, it was all down to the brain. Let's have a look at how the brain works, and that will explain whatever it is we're trying to explain, whether it's gender gaps in performance or autism, etc. And then other people would say, no, no, social constructionist model would say it's all the influences of patriarchal system or socialization, whatever. What I'm trying to say is that, the missing link is the fact that the brain will change depending on the experiences it has.
Mhm.
I mean, this comes back to the predictive model, if you like, but anyway, anybody who's a teacher would hope that the brain would change, because otherwise you're kind of wasting your time. But we can now see at the brain level how different experiences and even different attitudes can actually change how the brain works, because we now know the brain is changing throughout our lives, not just as it's growing. And that's a key difference in terms of explanations for all kinds of how brains get to be different. So the phrase "a gendered world makes a gendered brain" means that, yes, you may well find differences between the brains of men and the brains of women, but that could as much be due not only to innate differences, if there are any, but also to the different experiences they will have had because they're males or females.
one of the interesting kind of things I think you brought up in your book in terms of the process of investigation, scientific investigation, is that we can only go so far in terms of understanding autism by just doing kind of lab-based research. And you actually point to the importance of memoirs and first-person narratives in terms of giving us an idea of where we should be looking in terms of understanding the female experience of kind of autism, which I think is a very, kind of important reminder for all of us in terms of kind of looking broadly for the material in which we generate our hypotheses about. So, which leads us, I think, as you point out, that what stands out in these memoirs is the issue of camouflaging. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I mean, thank you for asking that question or making that observation because it was a sort of wake-up call to me, really, because the kind of research that cognitive neuroscientists do, they work with psychologists to develop paradigms, a task you can put in a scanner and comes back to the idea, there was a lot of work done on perception at the end of the last century, autistic perception, and you were showing visual illusions and showing that autistic individuals were less susceptible because they paid a lot of attention to the details and not the context, which is how visual illusions occur. So we were imposing our understanding of why autistic people behaved the way they did without really asking the autistic people, saying, what is it like to be you? How do you experience the world? What is it that makes you anxious, that upsets you, that you can't cope? And certainly the early wave, there was sort of wave of very powerful personal testimonies by late diagnosed autistic women, which really served as a part of a wake up call to the autism community research and clinicians that there were autistic women, but these were women who weren't diagnosed till in their 30s or 40s, 50s, even later. And this wasn't, they suddenly woke up autistic. They'd always been autistic, but they'd had all sorts of issues, difficulties in their lives, being told they had social anxiety, they were borderline personality disorder, they were given all sorts of different medications because nobody thought, oh, maybe the problem is because they're autistic. And once they were given that term, they were told, you appear to be autistic. The huge relief was their initial response because it said suddenly my world made sense, because they could look back on all the difficulties they'd had. And with their new understanding of what autism is, they could see why they'd been struggling all their lives. And then, of course, regret that if only somebody early on had spotted this was the difficulty they had, their lives would not have been so difficult. So I think the kind of idea that scientists ought not to impose, the observer, this is what autism must be like, and look at these visual illusions or pay attention to this pattern of dots, etc. You really need to say, what is it about your life that you find so difficult? I mean, one of the people I talked to said, I wish I could switch off my what if center in the brain. Coming back to the idea that, big panic caused by a change of routine or some upcoming event was so anxiety inducing because your brain just went into all of the possible disasters that could happen. And, that understanding that has brought research into autism a long way from the early approaches.
I think we can kind of forgive you for lapsing into a dichotomy in one part of your discussion, where you kind of divide people into kind of the what ifs and the whatevers,
That's right.
um,
Yes.
which
Yeah, I
I
guess it's
find
I think it was an observation about characteristics in my family. There are the what if people who, as soon as you mention a future event, immediately you could see the long list of but what if. Whereas there's the whatevers who have got this kind of mental shrug, which, will cope. Um, and of course, almost all of the what if disasters never come to fruition. Um, and therefore but they've still the stressful experience of this might happen, whereas the whatever's, because it doesn't happen anyway, haven't had that stress. And that was characterized for me by talking to lots of people who particularly autistic women, late diagnosed, and said, my life has always been governed by absolute panic, by the suggestion that something might be different, or that you're going to have to confront an unusual situation or meet a new person, for example.
So what happens with girls when they hit puberty who might be kind of autistic? How do you um, uh, what do you think happens to them when they
Okay.
kind of confront that major reorganization of the brain that occurs in adolescence, the kind of hormonal shifts, and when you have a foundation that may be um, uh, more focused on, I'm not quite sure, well, let's just say the way autistic brains may be focused.
Yes. Well, I think the chapter in the book, I call it the perfect storm, because um, exactly that. First of all, in Western civilization, you change from as adolescence occurs, so the age at which adolescence occurs, puberty occurs, is also the age at which you change from primary school to secondary school, um, which is a huge, if you actually think about it, it's a huge social upheaval for anybody, not just autistic individuals. So you've gone from your nice, sort of predictable primary school, small classes, same teacher, same friends. If you're an autistic girl, you might have negotiated that part of life by building what turns out to be, unfortunately, a rather fragile scaffolding structure that can hide the fact that your brain is working differently, that you don't experience the world in the same way that the other people in your class do, but you've managed to hide the fact. But then you move to secondary school, which is huge social upheaval, different teachers for different subjects, different environment, many more people involved in that, and as well as all the physical changes associated with puberty. So it is at that point that one of the things that's becoming clear from studying the emergence of autism in females, that appears to be a key tipping point. And very often girls who, according to, their parents and the teachers, have been no trouble at all throughout their primary school, all of a sudden massive social anxiety, perhaps school refusal, may manifest itself in conditions such as self-harm or eating disorders. And so this is a time at which, and as you said, also, of course, that's the time when all adolescent brains are being reorganized in a way we only recently have become aware of. So there's all this rewiring, in quotes, going on in a brain that's already got wiring that's gone awry. So it is a very difficult time, and not surprising that that's the point at which the girls have always been autistic, but it becomes clear that there is a major problem which hadn't been spotted to that point. And that's the point at which they're sometimes talking about camouflaging, and they've managed to disguise what's going on, the struggles they're having at an early age, but they can no longer disguise them, and that causes major problems. Or they have to work much harder to deal with the increased complexity of their world.
And you've really suggested that, a primary difference between males and females with regard to autism may be the predominance of camouflaging um, and a heightened salience of kind of social interaction for females as opposed to males, if I've got that right.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm suggesting, because I think there was, as I say, there was early on reference to possibly camouflaging. And then with, for example, personal testimonies, people started saying, oh, it does look like some individuals are disguising their autism, and their reference to camouflaging, which is trying to blend in. And when you talk to autistic individuals, they will describe in detail what they've been doing. They've been saying, I don't want anybody to think of me as different, even though, I've been called weird all my life or whatever. So in order to avoid being called weird, I've try and work out how apparently popular girls, for example, groups of popular girls, how they behave. I listen to how they interact, how they have chat, gossip conversations. I write scripts to mirror that, and I practice those kind of scripts. So it becomes clear that there's some people trying to blend in. There's other people who disguise it by masquerading. So they adopt a mask. They become the class clown, or they get into being very creative in unusual ways. And this appears to be much more common in females than males. So that was emerging as a pattern of behavior. But the question that wasn't asked, which the question which I raised, was, isn't it unusual in a condition which is supposedly characterized by a lack of interest in social interaction, by being aloof and withdrawn, that there's a group of individuals who it emerges are autistic, who are absolutely focused on fitting in? The reason they are so anxious is because they don't want, they want to engage with other people, they want to fit in, they want to find their tribe, etc. And all of their actually maladaptive camouflaging behavior, and I say maladaptive because it goes along with all sorts of mental health issues such as huge social anxiety, etc. This doesn't seem to fit in with our stereotypical pattern of what being autistic is. So that was the point at which I said, I think this may be where the difference lies, that you've got a group of people who really mind. The core issue is difficulty with social interaction. One group acknowledges they have that difficulty and ignores it. Another group acknowledges they have that difficulty, but does all they can to overcome it. And so that's where I think the difference lies. And that's starting to emerge with, eventually with brain images starting to look at females as well as males.
One difference that sort of stood out to me that you mentioned is that there's some evidence that indicates that um, there are differences in terms of sensory sensitivities between kind of males and kind of females, and that females may struggle with greater sensory sensitivity across the board than males.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that again is emerging, and it's interesting in terms of the whole history of females being ignored, is that sensory sensitivity has only just been included as a diagnostic criterion in autism. So in 2013, when the fifth edition of the Standard Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Problems was published. So sensory sensitivities were added, and then the research is showing that they are much more common, statistically speaking, on average, in females than in males, particularly textures. So clothing is there are many more problems. Parents will report many more problems in their autistic daughters with respect to different textures of clothing. Could well be underpinning what appears to be something like anorexia, but is actually much more to do with the color and texture of food, which appears to be a problem for a large number of autistic individuals, most of whom are females. So that is an interesting aspect of where these differences, another aspect where these differences might lie.
I think as a child psychologist, one very interesting area that's beginning to emerge is the experience of pregnancy and taking care of children for women who are autistic, because it's obviously an intense sensory experience,
Yes.
and for some women who kind of really struggle with sensory issues, it really makes them feel so badly about themselves that they're not feeling what they're supposed to be
Mm,
feeling, that they don't have the time to kind of recover or kind of, reorganize
mm,
themselves, and that certain aspects of the sensory experience of taking care of an infant
mm.
um, can be kind of challenging. Um,
Yes. Yeah. Yes, I think that's exactly right. I mean, With respect to adolescence, that appears to be a key point. Motherhood, pregnancy aspects, and what's now emerging most recently is menopause appears to affect autistic women um, more profoundly than non-autistic women. In some cases, a bit like the sort of adolescent story, very often it's at the point of menopause that women are being diagnosed as autistic. So there's clearly something very significant about the hormonal changes, which we've barely got to grips with at the moment. But also the motherhood story, if you read some of the work by autistic females, is the expectation, the social expectation of what being a mother should mean to you. Um, and then realizing it doesn't, and then therefore feeling I am, I'm other, I'm weird, I'm different because I can't engage with my child, or I don't know what to do with it when it's screaming, etc. Um, so all of those, seem to be part of the autism story, which is only just emerging.
And what you're saying about camouflaging is so important, as my daughter explained to me when she had infants, that when a mom goes in to see the pediatrician, they really want to look like they have their stuff together.
Yes.
They will, and so there is, some camouflaging that kind of goes on in terms of,
Mm.
what you're supposed to be kind of feeling, which I think gets steroids across the board for young moms. So if we can,
Yeah, yeah. Yes, so it's not just autistic women, but I guess because it's part of their anxiety, now I'm a mother, so I should be like this. They've already looked at not belonging to the popular girls' gang at school, and or not being fitting in well at their workplace, for example. And now here they go again. This is what the world is expecting of me, and I don't seem to be able to do it or to be it.
so, well, we're about out of time, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time out to kind of talk to us. Where can people find out more about you? And I know that your book is actually widely available in the United States. Uh,
Yes. Yes, it's also it came out at the same time in the UK. It's called The Lost Girls of Autism in the UK. Um, but the books are identical. They're not different. Um, with respect to, well, I think if you there's the New Scientist did a very good, flattering cover article on the book when it came out. So New Scientist readers could get the shortened version, the short read version. And they also did a YouTube, an interview, which is on YouTube. Um, so again, that's a sort of taster session, if you like, of the book. But otherwise, yes, there's quite a lot online. Slightly scary sometimes when I find it, but anyway.
well, great. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Well, thank you for the great questions. It's refreshing that your focus was very much on the autistic experience, because that was the breakthrough for me, really, as I got out from under my scanner and started talking to autistic individuals, which was eye-opening. So I hope the impact is that well, certainly the impact has been dramatic in the autism community. The book events that I've done and the consequences of these type of discussions is very often overwhelming messages of gratitude from women who now feel that they've been seen, and that they can arm themselves against people who say, your daughter can't be autistic because she's a girl.
Right. Well, great. Well, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for asking me. Thank you.